Welcome, everyone. This is our session on our Lobby Week Asks and Opportunities with CCL's Vice President of Government Affairs, Jennifer Tyler, and CCL's Research Manager, Dana Nuccitelli. To get us started, I will hand it over to Jen Tyler.
All right. Thank you so much, Flannery. I'm so glad to be here with everyone. That was a great, I think, first keynote to kind of kick us off and get our minds thinking about permitting reform. But I want to dive in kind of first more broadly. I'll start with many of you know I now have a 1-year-old daughter, and I've been thinking a lot about all the little things that she's learning every single day. Before becoming a mom, I really thought I'd be focusing on the bigger milestones, maybe her first steps, first real words, someday her first day of school. But being a mom has opened my eyes to all the smaller milestones in between. I never thought I'd be so amazed by her picking up a rock and not immediately putting it in her mouth, or learning to soothe herself back to sleep, although we're really still working on that one. But every night, my husband and I just fell over each of those tiny successes that for us are really huge. And that has shifted my mindset beyond just parenting. It's taught me to see how incremental yet significant progress really can be. The number of times she almost dives headfirst off the couch before realizing to go feet first, I can't even count. But every single wobbly attempt was part of her learning. And honestly, I had this thought. I think progress for an infant and for Congress isn't all that different. For both, it's incremental. And because it's incremental, it's significant. Every single step teaches you something that makes the next one possible. If we only measure success by the big milestones, like a carbon price or a sweeping climate bill that we will get, we're going to miss these smaller steps that are the building blocks of those larger moments. And those smaller steps matter not just because they're moving us forward, but because they show us how to move forward. What worked, what didn't, what doors are opening next. The lessons we learn now are shaping our future advocacy on larger goals like a carbon price. I know right now it can feel like all we see are the roadblocks, the polarization, the gridlock, the misinformation. But that's exactly why it's so important to recognize progress when it happens. Seeing progress isn't naive optimism, it's how we stay strategic. It's how we keep momentum and we find opportunities that still exist. And when we look at what's happening on the Hill right now, we can see those incremental but meaningful steps all around us. So here's what we've been hearing from Congress. A Democratic staffer working on the Fix Our Forests Act told us recently, your advocacy helped us have such a strong vote in markup. Think about that. Your outreach, your letters to the editor, your persistence helped get yes votes on that bill. Another Democratic office said, my boss was just asking why environmental groups aren't showing up anymore. I'm glad you guys are still here. That one really hit me because at a time when so many have stepped back from working on the federal level, you all keep showing up and doing the tough work. You're consistent and respectful, and you remind members that this work still matters even in the tough times. A senior Democratic Senate climate aide said, it's these most challenging years when we set the foundation for the biggest climate action. And one Republican member of the House said, it's good you keep reminding our guys how important this issue is. These voices from the Hill tell a story that your advocacy is seen, it's valued, and it's working. Even in the hardest seasons, you're changing the tone of the climate conversation in Congress, one meeting, one relationship, and one small but significant step at a time. And those quotes from the Hill aren't just nice words, they're backed up by real results. Over the past year, you've helped protect, advance, and lay the groundwork for climate progress, both in the short term and for the long run. Some of those wins have been big, but others a little quieter, but no less important. All of them have been crucial to preserving climate policies already on the books, advancing new ones, or setting the stage for future breakthroughs. So I want to dive into a couple of examples. The first one, we help protect existing clean energy policies. Avi mentioned some of those in his talk. When Congress debated the reconciliation bill, your outreach helped prevent a new tax on solar and wind and limit the steepest proposed cuts to clean energy tax credits. Our efforts helped avoid 1 billion tons of climate pollution over the next decade. That's like permanently shutting down 26 coal power plants. That's pretty massive, 26 coal power plants. You also help prevent deep cuts to clean energy and climate programs at the Department of Energy and critical NOAA programs in both the proposed House and Senate appropriations bills, which we now expect Congress to move on that the shutdown is over. Those victories may not make the headlines, likely won't, but they do help keep vital climate work alive. Second, together we've driven major progress on the Fix Our Forests Act, an essential climate, forestry, and permitting reform bill. Thanks to your meetings, your calls, and your letters, the House passed FOFA with a strong bipartisan vote. And that momentum carried into the Senate, where an improved bipartisan version was introduced with lead sponsors from both parties, and then passed out of the Senate Ag Committee with a strong bipartisan vote of 18 to 5, including support from the ranking member. As I mentioned earlier, Senate staffers are directly giving CCL volunteers credit for such a strong vote. That is no small feat, and it's a testament to the credibility, but also the persistence of your advocacy. And finally, we've helped build momentum on bipartisan permitting reform. This is one of the most critical pieces of unfinished climate work we have right now. Your advocacy helped support the release of the Problem Solvers Caucus Bipartisan Permitting Reform Framework, which set a shared vision for how to accelerate clean energy projects responsibly. Since then, we've seen a flurry of standalone bills introduced, including several bipartisan ones and public statements from both the chairwoman and the ranking member of the Senate EPW committee, confirming that bipartisan negotiations are underway. That's a direct reflection of the groundwork this community has helped lay. So when we look at our asks this November, we're not starting from scratch. We're building on a year of steady, meaningful progress, defending clean energy investments, advancing bipartisan climate smart forest management, and generating real momentum on permitting reform. And our Lobby Day asks are designed to build on that very foundation, both in what we can achieve now and what we're setting up for the years ahead. We're going to lean into the messages and tactics that we know are effective. We're going to avoid pitfalls that we've identified in the climate space, and we're going to keep the progress going. So with that, I want to dive right into our asks. This chart here gives you an overview of what we're asking of each member. So on the Democratic side of the aisle, for both Senate Democrats and House Democrats, we're going to be talking to them about permitting reform and the Fix Our Forests Act. For Republican members of Congress, in the Senate, we'll also be talking to them about permitting reform and the Fix Our Forests Act. In the House, we'll be talking to them about permitting reform and foreign pollution fee, which is another way of saying CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism legislation. So let's dive into our first one, permitting reform. We just heard a lot about it from Avi Zevin. It's obviously really top of mind because of the significance from a climate perspective. Our top line ask on permitting reform for all the members we're going to talk to is that we want them to negotiate and pass a bipartisan comprehensive permitting reform package. Our goal is to convince offices that we need to do permitting reform right now, not in a year or in 3 years. The messaging is going to be a little different for each side of the aisle, and we'll talk about what that looks like if you're meeting with a Republican member or a Democratic member. But the overall ask and the details that we know need to be included in a final package are all going to be the same. And we also are hoping that in your meetings, you're going to highlight the Problem Solvers Caucus framework as a pathway forward, a bipartisan pathway, and the National Governors Association letter on permitting, which we'll talk about a little bit more in detail. So with that, I will hand things over to Dana Nuccitelli, who will talk a little bit about those two pieces that you can highlight in your meetings.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. And so the idea with permitting reform is that we're trying to streamline the permitting process so that we can build our energy infrastructure and good projects faster. Sometimes offices will ask us, like, what do you want to see in a permitting reform package? And we don't lobby on specific details, but we have these two good resources that we can kind of point them to for an outline of what a comprehensive permitting reform bill could look like. And so we've got this one from the Problem Solvers Caucus, which is a group of 49 House members, roughly half Republicans and half Democrats. And they had a nice outline, a framework of lots of different stuff that they want to see in a comprehensive permitting reform package. Kind of mirrored what was in the Energy Permitting Reform Act from last year that we lobbied on. So lots of good stuff on transmission, which is really important, on streamlining agency reviews of legislative reforms, things like that, of judicial reforms. So a lot of stuff that we know is going to have to be in a comprehensive permitting reform bill. So that's just kind of a good outline that provides kind of an idea of what the package will need to look like. And we also got this letter from 13 governors in the National Governors Association, a very bipartisan list, governors from South Dakota, Oklahoma, Wyoming, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Utah, Colorado. So all across the political spectrum signed this letter. because they're realizing that their states, they need a lot more energy. They need to build a lot more infrastructure faster to meet that energy demand, to keep energy prices down, and to maintain energy security. So they had a lot of the similar requests. Similar outline is the Problem Solvers Caucus and the Energy Permitting Reform Act on transmission and NEPA reforms and things like that. So these are two really good resources to provide to your offices if they want to see kind of more details on what a permitting reform package might look like.
All right. And so when you go in, you've got those two resources to point to, but the messaging, as I mentioned, for each party is going to be a little different. Here's a message triangle you can refer back to if you're meeting with a Republican on it. In the center of the triangle is that top line ask. We want to ultimately convince them that negotiating and passing a bipartisan comprehensive permitting reform package right now is critical for them to do. So the messages that help us make that point for Republicans, one, affordability. We heard this from Avi. Obviously, there's a lot of concern right now about energy affordability, both from a national perspective, impacts on businesses, but especially impacts on homeowners and their constituents. So that's an argument you can make personally, what your concern is about energy pricing. Reliability is also another key argument there that you can make for Republicans in terms of permitting reform. When we have these new data centers coming online, we have these severe weather episodes threatening our electrical grid, we need to do permitting reform to strengthen our grid, to get more clean energy online connected to our grid in order to have that reliable source of energy. So we don't have blackouts, brownouts, any of those sorts of things, and we have energy available to things like data centers. So that's a key piece there to talk to Republicans about, is that reliability piece of energy. And then global energy leadership. This is an argument we've used for some other things before for Republicans, but the party constantly is coming back to this global competition. How is America competing on the global stage? And from an energy perspective, there's this strong desire, and Congress has really reiterated it many times, that they want America to really be the leader in global energy. We're competing against China, we're competing against these other countries. And in order to do that, we have to have a permitting reform system that is allowing us to build the energy, to transmit and transport that energy. And so, in order to compete on a global stage, we have to have permitting reform. That's that third piece of that triangle for Republicans. Moving along to Democrats, the most important point we can make to every single Democratic office is that we cannot afford to wait on climate action and that permitting is climate action. So we've got this triangle here still, but I want to highlight that this top piece of this triangle is applicable to every single Democrat, and that should be our first supporting argument for our ask for Democratic members. There's a hesitancy amongst some to kind of wait. There's concern about this current administration, what a package might look like, but we really have to stress that climate action is so critical for us to do right now. This is an urgent crisis, and we have to take action, and permitting reform is the immediate action we can take right now to address it. The other two pieces of that triangle are ones I just mentioned for Republicans, affordability and reliability. Those same concerns that you can hopefully lay out personally, that you're concerned about your energy bills, or you've read a recent article about rising costs of energy prices in your region, or maybe your area is subject to blackouts and brownouts, or has some threats coming up with maybe some winter storms. Those are both key pieces that you can highlight to try to persuade Democratic members that permitting reform is a necessary thing for us to do right now. All right, let's dive into our second ask. That is FOFA. We love an acronym, here in DC, the Fix Our Forests Act. This is an ask for all senators, Republicans and Democratic senators, and for House Democrats. So the only group we're not talking to about FOFA are House Republicans, and that's because they all voted for it when it passed the first go around. Our top line ask on FOFA is for all of these members to vote in favor of the bill. Pretty simple ask, right? Back to the co-sponsorship days, this is just we're asking them to vote for it. On the Senate side, we're urging senators to support the bill when it comes to the Senate floor. So hopefully soon it's going to come to the Senate floor. And if you're talking to a House Democrat, the ask is that they support the Senate version should it pass the Senate and come back to the House. So there's no bill right now under consideration in the House. The bill is in the Senate, and it will be at some point voted on by the Senate. Should it pass the Senate, which we will do everything we can to get it past the Senate, it's going to return to the House. So we want to get this ask in as soon as we can to House Democrats, that we hope they will support it once it returns to the House side. So that's the same top line ask for all members, but similar to the permitting reform, we've got a little different messaging for the different members. So I'll start again with Republicans. So this would be for Republican senators. The ask again is let's vote in favor of that bill. Let's vote in favor of the Fix Our Forests Act. There's three key pieces I think you can highlight for Republicans, and you might want to lean into one or two that are most relevant to you specifically. The first one is that it protects lives, property, and infrastructure. There's a lot of concern, obviously, for Western senators, but for all senators about the loss of lives, how much this is impacting local communities with homes being destroyed, businesses being destroyed, and public infrastructure, whether it's utility lines or major pieces of infrastructure that are really damaging to the community and to the surrounding region. So that's, I think, a pretty top line one that everyone resonates with everyone because we've seen just how destructive these wildfires are. Another piece is that this legislation restores the health of our forests. Republicans have long been concerned about conservation and making sure our forests and our public lands are preserved and protected for different reasons. And this legislation is going to allow for the expedient forest management projects that will restore the health of these forests. So it'll allow for these forest management projects to help preserve the forest, but also hopefully make them healthier over time. And lastly, saves taxpayer dollars. This piece kind of goes along with that first piece on protecting property and infrastructure, but when these homes are destroyed, when businesses are destroyed, when infrastructure is destroyed, when these devastation, incidents of devastation happen to communities, there's so much money that then has to go into rebuilding and making those regions safe for being habited again. And that money is not only local money, it's not only state money, it's also federal money. And that's an argument that really resonates with Republicans. For Democrats, that first top part of the triangle there is very similar to Republicans, protecting lives and property, except we switched out infrastructure for public health. Now, I think all members of Congress care about public health, but particularly for this legislation, Democratic members have been concerned with how wildfires have impacted public health predominantly through smoke pollution. And so that's another key piece that you can highlight there, that even if they're not a Western senator, we've seen wildfire smoke go all across the country, and that has really devastated states that are not normally in the path of these wildfires, but have caused a lot more public health concern and negative health impacts in these other states. We've also got here protects our forest, which is similar to what we had there for Republicans, but we added and reduces carbon emissions. So this is that climate piece for them. If we're able to prevent these wildfires, if we're able to mitigate them, make them smaller, that's going to prevent a lot of this carbon dioxide being released into the atmosphere and ultimately reducing those carbon emissions that we've seen just grow rapidly as these wildfire events have grown. And lastly, this legislation expedites critical forest projects without weakening core environmental safeguards. So this is that balance that we heard Avi kind of talking about. It's this tension, but it's a necessary tension that we're going to get right. And this legislation we feel does get right, where we're expediting those critical forest projects. We're making them quicker. We're allowing these experts to take care of our forests and prevent these fires, but we're doing that while making sure our core environmental safeguards are still in place. So those are those three bullets for Democratic members that you can kind of lean into, make them your own, figure out which one you think resonates with you and resonates with your state or your district. And we also have a resource document just for you all that Dana will walk through that gives you a lot more background info on this.
Yeah, and you can find this at cclusa.org/FOFA concerns. We put it into three different sections. One section we just recently updated is on what was added or changed in the Senate version from the House version of FOFA. Because the Senate sponsors, they added some new sections, and then when the Senate Agriculture Committee did their markup of the bill and voted in the 18-5 vote to advance it to the Senate floor, they also added some new amendments. In fact, about 17 new amendments. A lot of them introduced by Democratic senators and also several by Republican senators. And they added a lot of good stuff to the bill. Things on like adding a regional wildfire center in a lot of different regions of the country that would take into account information from shared by federal agencies, state agencies, academic experts and scientists, and things like that. So a lot of good things to also add tribal involvement, state involvement, expert scientific involvement. So that's some really good information, especially if you're lobbying a House Democrat who might not be familiar with what was added since the House passed their version of the bill, and you're lobbying your House Democrat saying, "Hey, there's some good new stuff in the Senate version of the bill. Take a look at some of this stuff, and maybe it might make you feel better about the Fix Our Forests Act." We don't want you to share this entire document with your offices, but you can share some of this information about what was added to the bill. We've also got a section on noteworthy provisions that you can look through to see if there's any particularly useful sections in the bill that might be of interest to your member of Congress. And then we've got a section up front addressing a lot of the concerns that we've been hearing from different organizations about the bill and our responses to those based on our reading of the text. So, for example, we looked at the text regarding the expansion of the categorical exclusions for these wildfire management projects, and we saw that the language of the text says that those projects have to maintain as many old growth and mature trees as possible and consider all the best scientific evidence and so on and so forth. And so we've got that information in this document as well. We'll also be doing a breakout session in about an hour or two. So we'll be talking about these same concerns, some more details about the bill, and we'll have lots of time to answer questions if you've got questions. So there's lots of good breakout sessions to choose from, but if you want to learn more about FOFA, then that's a good one.
All right. Yeah, I definitely encourage you to check out that breakout because I think there's going to be a lot of good information. So if you're a little concerned about maybe your member's response or you think you might get some pushback, definitely check that one out and hear from Dana. He'll have a lot of good pieces for you to use in your meetings. Our last ask is just for House Republicans, and that's on foreign pollution fee legislation, which is another way of saying carbon border adjustment legislation. And that's basically policy that leverages, it's trade policy that leverages a fee on different imports based on their carbon intensity. So this was a piece of some of the carbon pricing legislation, and this has been kind of spearheaded a lot by Republicans on the Hill. They've kind of latched onto this as one piece that they can really push forward. And we've seen a Senate bill introduced by Senator Cassidy, but we haven't seen as much action on the House side. So this ask we think is pretty timely to get more House Republicans engaged on this issue since Senate Republicans seem to be leading. And the four pieces we kind of want to highlight, the four arguments on that one is that foreign pollution tariff legislation would create fair competition for American industry, accountability for polluting nations. So again, thinking of these countries like China and India who have much less clean industry and much lower standards compared to American industry, making sure we're holding them accountable for that. It would be smart, targeted policy design. It would not be economy-wide, every single industry. It would really be targeted to the highest polluting industries. And it would really capitalize that on American leadership and improve our global leverage, again, by talking about that competition, talking about how we want a level playing field for American businesses and industry. So that covers all of our asks for all the different members. I think we've got a good amount of time now that we can jump into question and answers.
All right, fantastic. Well, we have lots of questions. So we'll start with our most upvoted one, um, uh, which are mostly about permitting reform, where we started the session. So Jackie is asking or pointing out that environmentalists have long used local controls to block projects that harm the environment. How can we bring them along on permitting reform?
Yeah, good question. I think this speaks to the kind of growing divide we're seeing in the environmental space where environmental organizations and climate organizations have a little bit of a different take on permitting reform. There's environmental organizations who their background and their focus is just on preserving the environment. And so they care about climate change as well, but that's not necessarily their top priority. For us, for CCL, that is our top priority. That is our goal is to address climate change. Now, we're not doing that without safeguards and making sure that we're still protecting the environment, but there is this growing divide on how people are going to approach permitting reform legislation. I think the key, if you're talking to a member of Congress specifically who is concerned about that and might have that more environmental approach, is that to Avi's Evans' point, it needs to be a balanced package. We need to make sure there are key provisions and safeguards in a permitting reform package to make sure that those environmental safeguards are in there, that we're not just moving forward with rollbacks to NEPA, rollbacks to the Endangered Species Act, but those core environmental statutes are still intact, and we're doing what we can on the edges to make permitting reform more efficient, or permitting more efficient and streamlined. And so I think the key message there is that if we sit on the sidelines and we don't make that argument and we don't add our voice to the conversation, it doesn't mean permitting reform doesn't happen. And as we're seeing, President Trump is going ahead with whatever executive authority he can to permit things as he wishes. So if we sit on the sidelines, things are already happening, and a permitting reform deal is being constructed by folks in Congress. And so the more that we're at that table, the more we're able to steer it in the right direction. If we're concerned about environmental safeguards, let's make sure those are in there. Let's be a voice at that table. So I think those are the key points. I don't know, Dana, if you've got anything to add to that.
Yeah, those are really good points. I would just add that the reality is we've got this really rapidly growing energy demand too, from especially AI data centers, but also electrification of vehicles and buildings. And the slower permitting is, and the less energy we build out, the less we're meeting that demand, the more it makes energy prices go up, which is just bad for everybody. Also, if electricity prices are going up, it makes it more difficult to justify like getting an electric car and a heat pump and things that use electricity, which are also really important for the climate and the local environment. And so, building this clean energy infrastructure is just a really important thing to do right now.
Okay, our next question is just a clarification. Can we still say that 95% of projects in the pipeline are clean energy? And where does that number come from?
Yeah, so that's from Lawrence Berkeley National Labs. They have a website on the interconnection queue pipeline, essentially. You can kind of Google that to find it. And it shows what the different energy projects are waiting in line in this what's called the interconnection queue, which is basically when local grid operators have to assess new proposed projects to see if the local grid can handle them or if they need to build some more transmission infrastructure to handle that new energy. And so when they look at the numbers, it's still the case that 95% of those energies projects waiting in the line are solar and batteries and wind, and then there's also a bit of natural gas. So that is still the case. The number is probably going to change a little bit moving into the future because we're going to have the solar and wind tax credits phasing out, and so there may be fewer solar and wind projects proposed, for example, but it's largely going to be solar and batteries because those are kind of the fastest things that can be built. They're still going to be the most cost effective even without tax credits. So the number it'll change a little bit, but it'll still be roughly the same outlook.
All right. And I'll remind folks, we have a lot of questions in the queue, so you can take a look and see if someone has asked a question you're interested in and upvote it so that we can get to it. Our next most upvoted question is from Alex in Montana. She's asking, is there a report or specific data that you would recommend we share with the aides we're meeting with this week about permitting reform?
I mean, as we noted, the Problem Solvers Caucus framework is a really good one to share because it's just kind of got an outline of here's like all the different components of what a permitting reform package should look like to get like bipartisan comprehensive support. And it's got lots of really good suggestions on transmission in particular, which from a climate perspective, transmission permitting reform is like the most important thing to do because we have to increase the capacity of the grid to handle more solar and wind projects. And right now the grid is kind of reaching its capacity, and so lots of good ideas in that particular document. So that's the main one I would use.
Yeah, and I'd encourage you, if you have time before your meeting, do a little bit of research on your member or figure out what specific piece of permitting reform you think will resonate with them. It might be the reliability piece, it might be the affordability piece, it might be transmission concerns if they've spoken about that publicly, and then you can figure out what sort of resources might be relevant. Maybe it's just data on how much energy prices are going to rise in your region, or maybe it's just reliability. We've had this many blackouts and brownouts. Sometimes we don't have to go as in the weeds on the specific policy data, although that's helpful for some members. Sometimes it's helpful to step back and make that more kind of person-centered argument, and use the data that you know is backing up your personal concern, your why for why you want them to tackle permitting reform.
Okay, great. Another question. Oh, I shouldn't have refreshed. It went away. I do want to clarify about the governor's letter. I saw a couple questions pop up when you first mentioned that. People wondered, is that okay to raise if their governor didn't sign it?
Yeah, I still think it's helpful. The fact that their governor didn't sign it does not mean their governor is opposed to it. The way the Governors Association works, it's typically, there's different committees and kind of caucuses within that are working on issues. So not every governor is as engaged in every single issue, and some governors are more engaged in the association than others. So it doesn't mean their governor is opposed. I think just the showing that there are that many bipartisan governors from all these various states, and there's certainly someone from a state near yours that are engaged on this and urging Congress to take action. That's a salient argument, I think, for any member.
Great.
Yeah,
Okay.
and that
Oh,
letter, the Problem Solvers Caucus document, they also showed there's this like building momentum that there's this recognition that permitting reform is like the most important thing to do right now from an energy perspective. And so that's just a general good point to show that governors understand that too.
great. Okay. We have David is asking a question about the Speed Act. Is that something that we are supposed to raise or asking our representatives to support?
Yeah, so there's a Speed Act, which is Chairman Westerman's bill in the House, and that's one that we're likely going to see some movement on. There's also the Speed and Reliability Act, which is a Congressman Scott Peters bipartisan transmission bill. So there's a bunch of speed acts out there as it relates to permitting reform. But ultimately, I think our message on both of those bills are that we are thrilled to see the progress. We're thrilled to see the forward momentum. Both of those bills are bipartisan. And we want to keep seeing this momentum. That being said, our ask is for a comprehensive package. We know that there's kind of these individual pieces that are being introduced and gaining their own sort of support, but ultimately we know that each of these pieces, NEPA reform, transmission, the certainty piece, all of those are going to need to be rolled into one package so that we have that negotiation that brings enough members to the table to vote yes on it. And that's our ask. So we're not endorsing these pieces of standalone legislation, although we are appreciative of these members leading on them, but we're not engaging on the specific provisions of each of these as a lobbying group. I have been privy to some of the negotiations, and offices have reached out to us for some guidance and feedback. So we do try to push these bills in the right direction, but we're ultimately not pushing for any of these standalone bills to pass. We're pushing for those to be negotiated on and rolled into a larger package that's going to address this entire issue in a way that gains enough support to pass the House and Senate and address some of these climate goals we have.
Sure, makes sense. Um, Another question that is here in the list is how do we deal with people who simply do not trust that the current administration would follow through with I guess, a permitting bill that's passed, given everything that they're seeing in sort of the wider political context right now? How are we thinking about that?
Yeah, I think that, that piece now we're referring to as kind of the certainty piece, right? That Avi mentioned and we've mentioned on some training calls before. And that's this concern that administrations from both parties have used their executive authority, and sometimes we think maybe crossing over the boundaries of their authority, but have used it to push permits that they support, cancel permits they don't support. And so there is this growing realization on both sides of the aisle that certainty has to be a piece of any final package. And so I think the response I would give to that is not only that we're pushing, we want certainty to be in a package, but that the process right now is not a good one. So recognizing, yes, we understand there's concerns that if a package is passed and signed into law, there might be concerns about how this administration would implement it, as there might be with any other bill right now. But not doing a package doesn't mean those harmful things are not happening as is. We are already seeing, permits being, countered by the administration, different projects being canceled. And so this bill would ultimately, if we're able to get one passed that has the certainty piece in it, which we know would need to be a piece of any final negotiation, is going to help reduce those things that are already going on. So not doing a package is not going to prevent that. Those things are already happening, and the more we're at the table shaping it, putting these key provisions like certainty in there, the better off that's going to be.
And I'd add this is a good reason for offices to engage in the permitting negotiations process to like make sure that if they're concerned about this, they voice their concerns and make sure they're satisfied with any language that's added to the bill to add this level of certainty, limiting executive shenanigans in the permitting process.
Sounds good. I'm seeing a couple questions pop up about the relationship between federal permitting and state permitting. So, Alan is asking or pointing out that state permitting is also a barrier. And so, how are we thinking about the relationship between federal permitting action and state permitting action?
Yeah, and Dana, you might have some more specific kind of detailed examples or something you can point to. But I think broadly, first I'll just say our focus as an organization is on federal policy and the progress Congress can make, in part because we think that's some of the most significant climate impacts that we can have is through federal policy. And I think we see that on the permitting level. There are definitely permitting processes on the local, state, and federal level. But a lot of those processes, the federal provisions are kind of the guidelines. They're kind of the top level. And so there's some degree of I don't want to say trickle down, but if you put a better federal system in place, it's going to positively impact those lower levels. That's not to say there doesn't need to still be work on the state and local level, because there certainly does. But we definitely think that the federal level, a lot of states and local governments kind of take their cue and have some of their provisions kind of guided by or limited in some cases by the federal statutes. And so starting with those federal statutes will improve those other pieces as well.
Yeah, and there was actually recently a survey of a lot of solar and transmission developers asking them like what is giving you the most trouble with permitting, and it was something like 70 to 80% said federal permitting is a bigger issue than state permitting, and like a slow NEPA process is particularly a challenge for them. So that's not to say that state and local permitting isn't also an issue. It absolutely is. Like there's a lot of like counties that are kind of putting up ordinances to block clean energy projects, which is a challenge, and I think there's other organizations working on that too, since like there's only so much we can do, and so we're trying to focus on the big levers in Congress.
I'll also throw in there, there's also some states that have led with some really good permitting reform processes and revisions to their own state policies. And so, if you're from a state like California or other places that have started to address some of these concerns to make clean energy projects and other development projects a little more streamlined, those are pieces that members at the negotiating table are looking at. There's ways to figure out, okay, is there a way to have that state policy kind of supersede the federal? If the state policy seems better here and it's still just as rigorous as the federal policy, can we adopt that one for this specific permitting process, whatever it might be? So I think there's also that kind of counter argument of if your state is leading on this, that doesn't mean this is not necessary. It means that what your state is doing could be helpful on a more regional level or a national level through this conversation.
All right, and we do have several more permitting questions, but I will encourage those folks to hang on for the conversation with Zian that's happening soon after right after the session. So I'm going to move on to a couple other questions that have our upvotes here. So Lisa is asking about another piece of legislation that I've seen in the news recently, the Untaxed Act, which is a bill that would make it harder for UN member countries to implement carbon pricing. She's wondering if there's any perspective on that, or if that's relevant for our lobbying right now.
Yeah, I was not aware of that bill, so appreciate you flagging it for us. But yeah, I can't really think of a relation to that to our lobby day. But I'll reiterate what Ricky said in his opening. If you missed that in the new year we are returning to pricing and engaging on that in a strategic way. So stay tuned if that's top of mind for you. We'll have a lot more forthcoming on that in the coming months. But yeah, I will look into that bill. I appreciate you flagging it for us.
Great, thank you. And on the topic of other legislation, there's a question here from Tom saying, some members of our group would like to ask our representatives to lower fossil fuel subsidies. Is this ask out of the scope of CCL's strategy? So thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think for right now, we're not talking about any subsidies right now on this in this lobby day. Permitting reform, although it relates to energy sources and which projects are being permitted and not, it is not addressing the subsidization of any permitting projects. And we did address that through the reconciliation debate earlier this year. Certainly, if there is a window where we feel like Congress is going to address that, we will definitely engage and be a loud voice on that. But right now, we are focused on permitting reform, FOFA, and foreign pollution fee legislation as areas where we feel like our voice makes the most amount of difference. These things are moving. We are seeing the momentum, and it needs our voice in order to steer it in the right direction or get it over the finish line. And so that's where we're engaging. So I would say for now, hold off on that. You know, should there be a window where we feel like Congress is engaging on this on either side of the aisle, we will certainly make hay of that moment and move on it. But for now, that's not something that Congress is actively working on or debating. That being said, permitting reform is going to address the fact that a lot of clean energy projects are not able to get permitted, and so there is this natural, kind of bias within the system for fossil fuel projects, and we have a lot of clean energy projects in the queue. So that concern of how do we kind of raise clean energy projects, lift those up, permitting reform is going to do just that.
Great. All right, with our last few minutes here, I'll take a few FOFA questions. So Don is asking, for a Democratic member of the House who has opposed the Fix Our Forest Act in the House, how would we convince them to take a new look at the Senate version that might make its way back over?
Yeah, good question. And I know we'll have a conversation with Zian about this, and then we have the breakout on FOFA as well. So we've got a lot coming on this, but I think the biggest one is recognizing, because I think some House members aren't totally aware, the Senate bill is a different bill. So it was not the House FOFA bill, House Fix Our Forest bill passed the House, and then the Senate took that bill up. It did not. The Senate introduced a new Fix Our Forest Act, which with four bipartisan Senate leads on it. So it's got a lot of obviously the same core provisions, but it does have some really important key tweaks that helped gain additional support on the Senate side and gain those two bipartisan, two Democratic lead co-sponsors, as well as some support of some additional outside orgs. I don't know, Dana, if there's any new provisions that you might want to highlight for them right off the bat that would be worth pointing to.
Yeah, I mean, I would suggest looking at our FOFA concerns document and the additions that we listed in there, both from the original Senate version of the bill and from the amendments. So, like, for example, if your member of Congress might be interested in all the additional tribal and academic and state involvement, and sharing of information among those experts, that might be a good thing to highlight. But there's a lot of different additions, and so it's a kind of a long list to look through, and pick out a few that you think might appeal most to your member.
All right. We have a question from Peter asking about, is there a way to make sure timber companies don't cheat and clear cut on public lands? And so I wonder if there's a certainty piece here too, just the same way you're talking about with permitting.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think we have a piece specifically on this in that concern document, and we'll be definitely talking about this in the breakout session as well. But we've made sure, as this legislation was introduced in the House and then again in the Senate, that the provisions were, the safeguarded provisions were in there to make sure that NEPA, the Endangered Species Act, all of these key statutes are preserved. So we feel confident that obviously we don't have control over how every piece of legislation is implemented and enacted per se, and we've seen a lot of things challenged in court, but nothing in this legislation allows for or expedites or anything of the sort, clear cutting. So there's nothing in here that would allow that or put a stamp of approval on anything similar to that.
Yeah, and all I like there's a lot of research that you have to do these forest thinning, fuel thinning projects in like a good way to make them effective. And the text in the bill is it's very clear. Like you have to like consider the best scientific evidence and preserve these old growth and mature trees and like do it in the right way. And we'll talk about more about this in our FOFA breakout session. But basically, and I think it's also important to bear in mind that like these projects are like written and implemented by the Forest Service and Forest Service staffers. Like they want to maintain forest health, like they don't want to clear cut forests. So I think like trusting that the Forest Service like career workers are they're trying to preserve forest health as much as possible is important too.
Yeah, I'll also mention just that I know we kind of think of everything maybe right now, and Republicans are controlling the House and Senate, and so this is a Republican bill, but we're going to have Zian from Congressman Scott Peters' office here, who's been a key player on Fix Our Forest Act, and there's been a number of Democratic offices who have led on this legislation, and we saw a strong bipartisan vote out of the Senate Ag Committee. So these concerns about clear cutting, while I think it's important we think of them and we make sure that it's not allowed, there's also, I think, a little bit of reassurance, not just in the data that we provide in the specific pieces of the legislation, but that all of these members of Congress, including these key Democratic senators and House members, have really combed through this legislation, and they certainly feel confident that this is not going to allow things like clear cutting or significant harm to our forests. So that's just another kind of piece there to hopefully bring a little bit of reassurance to folks beyond just the bill text or the data that we can provide you.
Fantastic. All right. Well, based on where we are with time, I think let's leave it there. I see Zian is on the line, so I'll hand it over to you for the next session.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration.
Like what you hear? Recommend us to your friends and make sure to give us a 5-star rating. It helps us show up on other listeners' feeds. Feel free to pass on any suggestions for future episodes in the comments as well.
And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.